Good morning, everyone. What I'm going to do is talk to you more about what Petar had introduced to you, so there's going to be some redundancy in this presentation. And we're talking about, of course, open circuit fatalities. And when you look at the data that we have published over the years, we have records of about 1,000 cases of decompression illness each year and about 100 fatalities. And an unknown number of non-decompression illness and other non-injury incidents occur every year, which is extremely important information. But up until recently, we've not been able to capture that information. And when you registered today, there was a card or a box there of cards that talk about our incident reporting system that we just recently introduced, so we can get this information. And like we do with our accident reports, we have information that can be useful to the diving community to help them reduce or identify and mitigate risks. Also, when you look at things, for example, like the, go back to that. So we have gotten information from an industrial setting to see the correlation between the number of reported incidents and fatalities. And using this information, we can then help to identify those risks so we can help reduce the number of fatalities that occur every year. Because any fatality is a tragedy, as we all know, and we want to make sure we reduce those over time. Now, also, we have collected information on the incidence of injury in recreational diving by sending our interns, and some of these folks had really tough duty, having to spend time on a liveaboard. I mean, it's really tough. And collected information, and we followed those divers through the series of dives they made, and then post-trip, so we could identify any injury and correlate those with the dives that they'd made. And you can see the injury risk or the incidence of injury varies depending upon the type of diving that's being done. And it's any number between 1 and 29 per 10,000 open water dives. When you look at fatalities, which is really what we're talking about today, as Petar mentioned, it's somewhere between 15 and 20 fatalities per 100,000 divers, which is roughly equivalent to the risk of fatality for automobile accidents in the United States. And a lot of that depends upon how you drive. In fact, if you notice, the driver is still in the cab of that truck, and in fact, if you look closely, he's on the cell phone. That's probably the reason why he's there. Now, let's put all of this in perspective and compare it to other things. For example, each year, 2 people are killed by swans. And I didn't realize swans were that dangerous. And 24 people are killed by flying champagne corks. So it's probably just as dangerous to go to a wedding reception as it is to go do some of the diving we've been talking about. 40 people are killed by falling vending machines. You've probably been in a hotel when somebody put their money in and grabbed that and shook it back and forth trying to get their goodies out of there. And about 100 people are killed swallowing ballpoint pens. Now, I mean, those things do happen. And about 150 people are killed by falling coconuts every year. 292 people drown in their own cars. And probably one of the most dangerous things in the entire world are toasters. And about 850 people are killed by toasters every year. In fact, we were in a Hampton Inn recently, and for some strange and bizarre reason, they had these miniature bagels. And people dropped them into the toaster. There's no way in the world those bagels are going to come back out of there. And so this woman had a fork trying to get that bagel out of that toaster, and she probably is one of those 850. And about 1,500 people each year are killed by accidental gunfire. And of course, like any technology, it all depends upon how you use that gun. And if you look, and if you look very closely, that says ATF on it right there. I mean, it probably should say WTF, but that's another thing entirely. So, okay, going on. When you look at DAN's global data, Petar mentioned there are about 25 to 28% of the fatalities each year are cardiac related. When you really dig down into that, about 60% of those people who were fatalities who had cardiac related involvement had symptoms prior to. Now, these are symptoms that they recognized and the people they were diving with recognized as cardiac related, 60%, and they continued to dive and ended up as a fatality. I mean, that makes no sense whatsoever. And 50% of the fatalities in the 40 to 59 age group, as Petar mentioned, the diving community is aging. When I first came to DAN 22 years ago, the average age of a DAN member was 38. The average age now is 46. When we used to go to meetings, we'd look out in the audience, see a lot of young faces. Now the faces aren't quite as young.
Now you can't see them, Dan.
Yeah, that's right. Well, they look the same then. Okay, then other data, 39% of the fatalities are certified for a year or less, and these are people who have limited experience and limited tools to draw from if a crisis occurs. 35% were certified for more than 10 years, and I can tell you that means absolutely nothing. That means that those people simply had a certification card in their wallet or purse for 10 years or longer. And 88% of the people died on the first dive of their dive trip. Now, I was in Long Beach, California recently at the Scuba show when I attended a panel on diving fatalities. And in Los Angeles County, 80% of the people who died in Los Angeles County died on the first dive of their dive trip. Now, when you look at the DAN data, you can see certification of divers by fatalities. And of course, right here, you'd expect a higher peak because of the fact that these are people, again, who are early on in their training and education. They have limited skills to draw from in case a crisis occurs. Here's something sort of interesting, the student area here. I don't think it really has anything at all to do with males or females. I think what this may represent are people who are in a program not necessarily for the right reason. They're there because someone wants them to be there, not because they want to be a diver themselves. Number of years since initial certification, again, doesn't mean a whole lot other than the fact that here you have people with limited experience and here you have people that have more than 10 years of longevity on their certification card rather than being qualifications as far as diving is concerned. This is probably much more important. These are the number of dives made in the past 12 months. And again, you can see a peak here with people, again, who have limited experience in diving and therefore they have the greatest risk, partly because they don't have all those tools and experiences to draw from if something happens so they can solve that problem. But here you also have people that have over 300 dives in the past 12 months and still end up as a fatality. And then you scratch your head and you say, why in the world with somebody with that kind of experience and those experiences still end up as a fatality? Well, a lot of it can be some of the things we talked about early on that Simon talked about, that Petar talked about, and these may be people who've been diving so frequently they feel they don't have to follow all the steps necessary to be fully prepared for the dive. In fact, not too long ago, a guy that I knew was going on a rebreather dive, and he was talking to people the day before, and he said, I don't need to use those checklists any longer. It's intuitive for me. I just do it as a matter of habit. And of course, the next day, they found him unconscious on the bottom. He'd forgot to hook up the oxygen line in his rebreather. So those checklists are extremely important, and those pre-dive rituals are extremely important. Weight classification of the diving population. They have 3 different populations here. This is Project Dive Exploration, which is where we're collecting information on dive profiles. We think that is roughly equivalent to the diving population, the normal diving population, if normal applies to diving. And the orange here is injury population, and the white is fatality population. You can see roughly in the injury and normal diving population, they are pretty similar, but you can see that when you're talking about those who are overweight and obese, it's certainly skewed towards that end of the spectrum. And of course, weight can create a lot of issues, some exercise tolerance, some other issues that could be a way to increase the risk in diving. But of course, a lot of times you look in the mirror and what you see isn't necessarily reality. And as we may know, once you've had a drink or two, that kind of skews your perception a little bit, so things aren't exactly what they seem. Now, we did an analysis of nearly 1,000 of our fatality cases to try to determine the factors that turned a recreational dive into a tragedy. And these were cases that we reviewed from 1992 to 2003, again, to try to determine what those steps were that turned that dive into something certainly a lot worse. And a lot of times when someone is delivered to a medical facility, they are wet, they are dead, therefore they're simply labeled as drowned and case closed, and nothing is ever investigated beyond that, and that is really a tragedy as well. It's made it a double tragedy because we can't learn from what happened. And one of the reasons why Divers Alert Network is in existence is to help us all learn from what happens to other people. So what I'm going to talk about here briefly, which is something that Petar was talking about, and evidently there's a glitch in the system here, that I'll talk about what I call the cascade towards death, which is those 4 different steps that turned a dive into a tragedy. And along the way, I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to tell you a story about a dive group that was diving less than a year ago, and that dive was supposed to have been a fun dive. In fact, it was celebrating someone's birthday, and it was a dive group, a large dive group. They had what we'll call an open buddy relationship because nobody had a formalized buddy. They were all simply diving in the ocean together. And there was a second dive of the day, and clear water, calm seas, no current, no other issues there that would have compromised the safety of these divers, and the depth was approximately 60 feet of water. So we'll start looking at these steps that Petar identified, the trigger, which is the earliest identifiable root cause that transformed a relatively unremarkable dive into an emergency that led to a tragedy. When you look at the data, as Petar mentioned, 41% ran out of breathing gas. 41%. That's hundreds of divers that could be alive today if they're able to manage their breathing gas supply. Hundreds of divers that could be alive today if they and their diving partners were able to manage multiple gas supplies, and they could not. And you look at the other issues, entrapment, equipment problems. I actually don't think it's equipment problems. I think it's problems with equipment. This is something entirely different. Rough water trauma, buoyancy, and inappropriate gas. So when you look at this, starting with that trigger, going back to this case history, diver number 1 ran out of air at 45 feet of water. Exchanged air and successfully began exchanging air with diver number 2. Both divers attempted to jettison the weight from the buoyancy compensator on the diver who ran out of air, but they couldn't do it because they didn't know how. So they were seen down there struggling, pulling, grabbing, trying to do whatever they could to get those weights out of that integrated BCD, and they could not do that because they had never, ever looked at that BC before. The first time they ever looked at how it worked was when this emergency took place. Then they also tried to, because they were sinking towards the bottom, tried to inflate the BC of the person who was providing air, and they couldn't do it because it wasn't connected properly. No air was going in the BC. So they were continuing to sink to the bottom, even though they were trying desperately to get to the surface. So the BC did not work. Now, going on, here we have the next step, which is harmful action. Definition of root cause, generally a reaction rather than a planned and practiced action, which they should be, that exacerbates the situation or certainly makes it a lot worse. So the data says 55% emergency ascent or escaped to the surface. This isn't necessarily a planned, practiced emergency ascent process, but people then will escape to the surface because they know there's air there. They know that, or they hope anyway, that they'll be able to be safe once they reach the surface. So going on with this case history, divers number 1 and 2 attempted an emergency ascent but continued to sink because they couldn't do anything about the weights in the BCD, could not do anything about putting air in the other's buoyancy compensator. Diver number 1 was seen reportedly looking at, or they think he saw, the pressure gauge of the person that was supplying him with air. And so his last act was to push her away, push her towards the surface, break contact, saving her life. And so this leads to the next area, incapacitating injury, an action that caused death or rendered an incapacitated diver susceptible to drowning. And the data says, of course, asphyxia is simply nothing to breathe. And that was the case with these people. They were running out of air. And he, in a heroic act, pushed her away and literally saved her life. So diver number 1 originally ran out of air, was sinking towards the bottom. Diver number 3, once the person got to the surface, she looked down, she saw another person coming across the bottom to provide assistance to the guy who originally ran out of air. And then that led to the next step, which is cause of death, and that is specified by the medical examiner that might be the same as disabling injury. In this case, it's simply drowning. And so what you had in this case was diver number 2 surfaced successfully. She was pushed away in trying to provide air. The bodies of diver number 1 and number 3 were recovered later. Both had no air remaining. And so when you look at all of these steps, this is something that was caused initially by running out of breathing gas. And how can people run out of breathing gas when you have the technology available to us today? All you have to do is be aware of the fact that you have gas available to you. The next problem was problems with equipment. Again, equipment problems are not the issue, it's problems with the equipment. Equipment problems, in my mind, implies a design flaw. Equipment nowadays is really in good working order, designed very, very well, but as Dr. George Harper in Ontario said, because he did most of the inquest for fatalities there, he was not able to find a single case where equipment malfunction caused a death or injury to a diver. It was the diver's use of the equipment that caused the problem. And then looking at the other issue was buoyancy. They couldn't control the buoyancy. They had no idea how to get rid of the weights out of the BCD. They had no idea that the BC of the other person did or did not work. They didn't test or practice that before they went in the water. So all of these things conspired to develop the loss of 2 different people. So what we have, when we talk about diving safety, it means preventing divers from becoming a statistic each year, and we can do that. We each individually can do that. There are a lot of things that we can do to make sure diving is indeed safer. So what I want to do is to look at these 100 divers that we talked about. If we lose 100 divers every year, there are reasons why we do that or why that happens, and we can make changes there. For example, you have 28 divers who are lost each year because of cardiac issues. And we talked about before, some of these divers, they had symptoms that they displayed prior to or during the dive but continued to dive anyway. But those 28 divers are lost from the diving community. And then we had, of the remainder, we had 2 divers who switched to an inappropriate gas as part of the dive, and they unfortunately were lost from the diving community. We had 3 divers out of that group that were lost because of buoyancy issues, and those are things that we can correct. All of those problems, when you look at the accident scenarios, all of those things are things that can be corrected, and those 3 divers are lost from the diving community. 4 divers had trauma of some sort. They were either hit by something or hit something during the ascent, and unfortunately they were lost from the diving community. 7 fatalities due to rough water, people who couldn't cope with having to swim through rough water or off a shore dive, for example, in California when they never had any experience with wave action before, and they were lost from the diving community. Then you had 11 divers who had problems with equipment problems that could have been resolved had they actually taken the time to work together with their partner, and those divers unfortunately were lost from the diving community. We had 15 that were entrapped by going into shipwrecks, for example, or going into caves without the proper training, equipment, and qualifications to do that. And those 15, unfortunately, were lost from the diving community. And then we had 30 of those people each year that run out of breathing gas underwater, which should never, ever, ever happen. And those, unfortunately, were lost from the diving community. And there's no reason why these things should happen because we are all intelligent people. We all just need to follow those pre-dive rituals that we talk about and those checklists we talk about to make sure that we mitigate those risks and eliminate those risks. So how many of these divers might not be a statistic each year if diver error was eliminated as a triggering event, and probably a large portion of those. So we want to make sure we're not caught in that cascade of events that ultimately hurts us or the people that we dive with. And so we need to make sure that when you are out there diving, enjoy the diving world. I mean, it's absolutely fantastic. There are so many things to see and so many things to do, and risk should not be something that really weighs heavily on your mind, but it's something that we have to consider each and every time we dive. And especially if you travel to great distances, you want to make sure you are fully prepared. And it's not, there we go. Houston, we've got a problem. Well, we're wishing that every single dive you make is accident injury free. Thank you all very, very much. Anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
Dan, your question, 1,000 DCI incidents in the States.
Those are our members. Those are...
Sorry.
Okay, your name, please.
Gareth Locke
Yes.
from the UK.
Yes.
The 1,000 DCI incidents you've got, that's reported to Dan.
Those are reported to us from our members, the Dan America members, diving all over the world. And we,
that's total global population?
no, of the Dan America members.
All right, sorry, Dan
America members who travel around the world and dive. And we know that's probably not nearly all the cases that occur.
Okay.
Just the ones.
Yeah, I mean, the numbers in the UK are around the 350
Yeah.
a year that are treated by the chambers.
Yeah. And we know that there are people who don't report. We know people to unfortunately treat themselves. So there are a lot of reasons why we never get that information. And so,
Okay, thanks, Dan.
yes, sir. And your name, please.
Tony Howard again from the UK.
Yes.
There was one item in that scenario that you proposed earlier on about the group of divers who went diving together, and apart from the obvious issues related to things like buddy checks, familiarisation with your own equipment, I'm assuming a lot of those were rented equipment. The one thing that overridingly comes to me out of this, and something that happens when I'm doing my training, is that they were obviously overweighted to start with.
Yeah.
And that is such a common issue. It's often glossed over a little bit too much. Too many divers don't have the right trim, and the biggest problem in diving without trim is you've not got any control left of your buoyancy. You're wasting gas to start with, and you're gas with another issue.
Exactly.
It's the old domino effect. You haven't got your trim right, you haven't got your buoyancy right, everything's going to go to pot.
Yeah, exactly right. In fact, one of the things that we talk about is we suggest that divers have a logbook, and when they're diving someplace and they wear a wetsuit, they record the suit they're wearing, they record the amount of weight they're wearing to make sure that they do that exactly the same time, because otherwise they simply repeat that process of overweighting themselves every single time they return to that same diving environment.
Absolutely.
Or people that are trained in freshwater who are wearing wetsuits who then go to the Caribbean who are not wearing wetsuits. All of those things is extremely important. You're absolutely right. Yes, sir.
My name is Alex. I'm from the U.S. I saw that uncertified divers have a fatality rate exactly the same as commercial divers and instructors. Can you explain that, please?
The fatality rate is the same. Was that uncertified divers was the same? I have no idea why. Yeah, could be.
You ask about uncertified divers and using rate. We don't know what's the rate for them because there is about 7 billion people who are uncertified in diving. So what you will take as a denominator.
No, no.
Well,
No, because a lot of times they're simply called drownings, as we indicated before. So they could be wearing diving equipment when they go into the medical facility, and if the person's not familiar, they'll simply label it as a drowning, and that's it. Yes, David, do you have a question?
Can't really hear from the back.
Okay.
I think there was a buoyancy.
Yeah, talking about overweighting.
Right.
Yeah, about the problem with people chronically overweighting
That's the
themselves.
same thing that I was thinking
It was
the whole
David
time
Boaz,
back
by the way.
there.
Yeah.
If they're at 45 feet,
We're speaking to the microphone.
if they're at 45 feet and they can't get to the surface with one or two kicks, or
Yeah.
even a little manual inflation of your BC without dropping the weights, then they're
Yeah.
all overweighted.
Yeah.
So have you looked at that?
Yeah, overweighting is really a problem, and and of course, what we try to do is make sure we pass that information on to the training organization so they can continue to encourage people to make sure they're weighting themselves properly. Or we recommend that people, if they're going to go on a vacation, find a way to be able to do a shore dive first, or find some way of being able to do their weights properly before they're actually out there in a more aggressive dive spot.
But you haven't really been able to look at that as a factor.
It's hard to get a lot of that data.
Yeah.
Okay, again, thank you all for being here.